when I showed up in the 70s, uh, there were some very nice renditions of Picasso and Modigliani and Miro, and M.C. Escher was very big, and Vasarely, a geometric work from a Swiss-Italian artist. Vasarely was popular, and it seemed like every household had a few works that they would continue to produce, that they tend to guard their sources with. But by the 80s, with pastels coming into vogue, and by the 90s, when Navajo rugs were the rage, we didn't see much modern artists. But around 1995, there was a sudden surge of Diego Rivera's work. And so some of his more simple designs with the woman holding calla lilies in her back to the viewer was a very popular image in the mid-90s. Yeah. Oh, a lot of people were doing Picasso's Guernica in the 70s into the early 80s, in big tapestries. This one guy, who's still around, Herminio Martinez, did like a 6-foot by 13-foot, very nice interpretation of a Guernica. And for some reason in the 70s, that was still a very important thing that people want, to put in their house. Horses being run over and people being shot. This quarterly magazine by the Southwest Museum in Los Angeles, where they were, there's about an 8-page article about the Las Montañas family in the winter 1989 article. A real brief look at how I view the decades of Teotitlan. The 70s were pre-Columbian art, maybe the 60s were modern art. The 80s were pastels and introducing to the Santa Fe look of the Southwest design, and rather simple designs. In the 90s were Navajo designs, the coming of prominence of Kevin Costner's Dance with Wolves was the rage, and everyone wanted copies of Navajo rugs, and Santa Fe, boom, was Zapotec rugs. And the 2000s were when Arnulfo Mendoza introduced, Isaac Vasquez was the forefront of pre-Columbian designs in the 70s. Arnulfo Mendoza transformed the look of Teotitlan weaving in the 2000s with his wonderful reinterpretations of early classic Mexican serape patterning. And for that whole decade, Teotitlan for the first time really was acknowledged for having its own authentic design sources, or look, that wasn't Navajo, which was predominant in the 90s. And then since 2010, these last 9 years, it's hard to define any one thing. The whole design field in the States has become more eclectic, and I think that's reflected in Teotitlan too. Still with a desire by most families to present something in the market that's distinguishable for their own production, that's unique in some ways, so everyone's looking for a niche now. But we see in the 2010s, this current decade, a little bit of everything of the last 5 decades that I mentioned, but previous to this, there were pretty predominant themes for every 10 years. If it sells, they'll do more of it. If it doesn't sell, they'll be less likely to do more of it. And, anyone who buys a rug will let them know, how important that look is for them. Colors, designs, size, etc. So the feedback is pretty constant. And in the 80s, a store called Santa Fe Interiors that actually advertised in Architectural Digest that had a really beautiful shop a block off the plaza in Santa Fe, headed by Michael Weinland, who had really great design and color sense, started mass-producing rugs in Teotitlan with about 15 different houses doing mostly hand-spun wool yarns, textured pieces of a lot of contemporary works that sold well as Navajo designs. And he was the first of we importers to make note of a design sense that distinguished Zapotec weavings to the stateside people, that he kept repeating these patterns that were in his catalog. for about 10, 15 years. You know, Santa Fe was the most popular tourist destination on the planet in the 80s. And Santa Fe Interiors by Michael Wineland, which were producing thousands of rugs a year, you know, maybe 10,000 rugs a year here, really captivated the market and brought a lot of attention to Zapotec weaving. I pat myself on the shoulder, recognizing that their dyes weren't color fast. And that when I started doing my line of rugs, which has been taken over by Escalante Rugs since 2012, I started mine in year 2000. I made sure we had color fast dyes. The other person who did a line of rugs in the early 80s was Richard Enzer, and he had worked in Persian rugs in the 70s, and he had a great design sense. And he was he started a whole look of rugs in the 80s with just sort of primary colors, indigo blues and rich, lively middle reds and some gold colors, very well nuanced with hand-spun yarns. He sold that business to the woman who has run a gallery for 40 years successfully in Taos, Susanna Starr. And she's carried on his line and still produces them here in Teotitlan, but he took his wonderful design sense and better dyes to Romania at just a time when the Iron Curtain fell. And he found these people of traditional rug weavers and tapestry weavers in rural Romania who were without employment. And they started producing the best flat woven rugs I've ever seen, as good as the best Navajo rugs from the 1920s when they wove really tight rugs. And he took over the market with his rugs, and he had the women in Romania hand spinning yarns a little thicker than Teotitlan yarns, but because their loom was a typical European tapestry loom that didn't have foot pedals, but the warps were strung very tightly on a vertical loom with just little heddles on the loom like a Navajo weaver does, we're able to pack all the rugs down very tightly with a little comb. So they were as tight as the best ever Navajo rugs, thicker than Teotitlan, because they weigh 30% more than Teotitlan rugs. And he brought his Teotitlan design expertise of Navajo weaving to the States and did really well with that. And that was just one more input for us of how to evolve a contemporary sense meshed with traditional Navajo weaving to the design field in the States. I credit Richard Edmonser and his line of the Spirit rugs for drawing us closer to a lasting identity with their Zapotec weaving, even though his was from Romania. It was a rough and tumble, ruthless type of thing. In 1984, I had contact with the LL Bean catalog, and I was selling my rugs in Maine at their store, right? And they said, yeah, we want to go to the catalog. Well, I made the mistake of just hinting that I had a chance to get into a catalog in the East Coast to one of my competitors here in the Teotitlan. He flew directly to Boston and drove up to Maine and said, I can do much better than Scott Roth. And he got the nod for 3,000 identical pieces for their catalog. And I learned a little bit about gentlemanly competitiveness. The Teotitlan weavers amongst themselves find that nice border of acknowledging rules of the game, of how you might take someone's design or take someone's weaver, but you're not going to wipe him out, and he's welcome to fight back and try to regain that weaver or take one of your designs. But two of the importers that were of my hippie generation were a little more ruthless than others. Philip Weiner was his name, and he did so well in 10 years. He was the first one who went to all the trade shows and huge volumes of very pastel-y looking rugs that he was able to retire and move on to something else. So I was late to the game getting to Santa Fe. I didn't show up there until about 1984, and which was the big market for Zapotec rugs. And there were already 8 Teotitlan importers with big presence in Santa Fe by then. But I started selling a lot of big rugs in the in the late 80s into the 90s and through the 90s before I started my own line of rugs in year 2000. And it became apparent that Teotitlan had a very marketable product for large throw rugs up to 9x12s. So I specialized in that. Where I had an advantage over importers in the 90s is that I was living in Teotitlan for about 4 or 5 months a year with Honore Gonzalez and his family. And I was able to seek out the best pieces and take time to develop palettes with weavers that weren't my own doing, my own dyeing. But so by the time I started my own business in 2000, I really had an advantage over other weavers, and most galleries in the States who wanted a good quality large rug would, and designers would come to me. So by then the other importers were starting to lose market niche. So I'm just saying I was late to the game, but I'm glad I brought a better product to the market. I had a trade route that was all the Rocky Mountain states: Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana. That was pretty much my trade route. And I slowly expanded that, and Idaho. And I expanded that considerably from 1979, my first forays into Aspen, Colorado, 1978 actually. Through 2010 I kept expanding. I drive twice a year, about a 5,000 mile trip that would take about 6 weeks, with a week in each famous tourist area, be it Jackson, Wyoming, or Sun Valley, Idaho, or Aspen, Colorado, or Santa Fe, to a lesser extent Park City, Utah, and Phoenix area, Tucson area for a week. It took time to see the designers and supply my clients with rugs, the galleries with rugs. So it's about 6 weeks on the road twice a year. But in Teotitlan, I was also seeing what other importers were weaving, and that gray area of respecting proprietary designs and colors was crossed by all of us, that we were all taking advantage of finding out what was popular. About every 6 years, I'd get a sudden request for natural rugs of the undyed hand-spun yarns from Chichicapa, or dyed or natural yarns from factories here. But it would last for about a year, and then it would fade. And it was about 3 years ago we suddenly got a very strong call for natural undyed fleeces in whatever designs. And we started dyeing yarns that looked, I have some really great formulas that looked like natural fleece tones of cinnamon browns into golden browns and gray browns. And we've been doing well with that for 3 years, and there's still a strong call. And I think it's the millennials who are recognized for being back to the earth, being very environmentally conscious, and being a strong call for natural foods. But I want to point out why Teotitlan was so quick to respond to us 20-somethings who came here in the 70s and 80s and wanted more rugs, was that, for one, they had not grown up with TV. They were very much and they hadn't gone past secondary school, since past 8th grade. And so they didn't live in their heads, they lived in their gut, they lived in their heart. And they had a much more flexible, fluid type of energy to respond to the market calls that we came from. These kids who spent their youth, about the time I showed up, just sort of wild, going up in the hills every weekend and bringing down firewood for their mom's cook stove, and a lot of them bred sheep up in the mountains. They were in great physical shape, and they were, kids who were adventurous out in the wilds about the helicopter parenting of post 9/11 era, are more exploratory, more nimble to respond to any given set of opportunities. And one more thing I want to mention about this perfect storm, they had eaten what would now be considered by the elitist natural foodies in the States, the ideal organic diet that was freshly prepared every day of local organic corn, a little meat, a fair amount of vegetables in the chilies, and a little bit of sugar, but none of the bagged processed food at all. So and it showed, these people had so much vitality and health. It was just incredible. And that was part of this perfect storm, that they were able to start working 15-hour days, weave 8 hours a day, plus all their other tasks. And whereas now you find them a little more the next generation in Teotitlan. First came the TV generation, then the internet generation. And they're young kids here down, like throughout Mexico are obese and just not as vital. One more thing of the perfect storm is the Guelaguetza tradition, which in Teotitlan, not so much the Guelaguetza famous dance in Oaxaca, but the Guelaguetza tradition in Teotitlan is where you give with faith to someone else to support their endeavor, knowing that there's a long establishing trust agreement that they will return the favor when you need the support, economic or labor support. And that was so well established in Teotitlan and was so successful that everyone had these great support networks, social safety nets, if you will, of one economic and labor form, that they extended that goodwill to us weavers, to us importers. And a lot of us really weren't well capitalized. And so many weavers in Teotitlan who were the leaders, took the initiative in this growth period in the 70s and 80s, would loan us with credit huge amounts of rugs, which would give us 6 months to pay back. And that really, you don't see that in Mexico, that type of trust. Every single deposit I've made outside of Teotitlan for whatever type of business transaction, the man ran away with my money because there's no jurisdictional force in Mexico to bring to court a contractual agreement and bring about a resolution for the contract. There's none of that in Mexico. Whereas Teotitlan has this long history of trust that they believe was going to extend to us, and it did. And I, fortunately, being a single person, never needed to have extra capital. I took a few loans from the weavers, but more I was on the other side of advancing money for their capitalization. But just that goodwill, I think it showed up with the heads of these families telling their weavers, yes, I'll be getting a check from this importer in a month, can you wait? In the meantime, give me a few more rugs. So all in all, everyone was willing to give and take on these needs for the capitalization that was happening. And I see that at great extent on the Guelaguetza mentality, that you trust, give forward your efforts, knowing that it'll come back to you in time.